most anyone who is paying attention to politics in today's world understands that a global government is on the horizon and is inevitable at some future point. With that comes a global currency and international laws which will dictate the quality of life for all people. Are you looking forward to living your life under the authority and control of a centralized global government? Another question to consider is, would that be a bad thing? But in order to answer these two questions, we must first address the three requirements for a global government. First, there must be a widely perceived need for such a global system being put in place. In order for that first requirement to be met, a chaotic event or threat of some sort must happen. This can take many forms, such as war, terrorist activity, or financial instability. Second, there must be a control upon the media in order for the public to accept this idea, whether the whole concept of a global government is being carried out by stealth and conspiracy, or whether it is truly a legitimate need in the world to preserve peace, safety, and prosperity. Third, there must be a control upon the education system for the global government to run smoothly once it has become a reality. It is necessary for the average person in this global society to identify themselves not as an individual with individual rights and liberty, but as a member of a collective body of global citizens who act as the various parts in a smoothly running and efficient global machine. Common sense will tell you that the idea of individual liberty and rights given by God are completely contrary to a smoothly running global society. Anyone who believes that God is the final authority in any matter will not allow themselves to be in subjection to a ruling body of people who institute laws and ordinances which are in conflict with their understanding of God, who He is, and how He wants us to behave. This documentary will look at these three basic requirements for a smoothly running global society and leave the viewer to decide for his or herself if this concept is one which they would or would not embrace.
World government is the structure necessary for global justice. You know that we have come to the point of our really being here this evening, and that is to honor with the Norman Cousins Global Governance Award, Walter Cronkite.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And there are many of us here who had wished back a couple of decades ago that we had been addressing you as Mr. President in a slightly different environment. Well, there are two reasons really why I'm particularly grateful and honored by this award. The first, I believe, as Norman Cousins did, that the first priority of humankind in this difficult era is to establish an effective system of world law that will assure peace with justice among the peoples of all the world. Second, I feel rather sentimental about this award and this organization because half a century ago, Norman Cousins offered me a job as the spokesman and the Washington lobbyist for the really nascent organization called World Federalists. When I had my own strong opinions, I tried to put them aside for the moment in the interest of fairness. I didn't communicate to my hope to my audience. Now, however, my circumstances are considerably different. I'm in a position to speak my mind, and by God, I'm going to do it. First, we Americans are going to have to yield up some of our sovereignty. That's going to be, to many, a bitter pill. It would take a lot of courage, a lot of faith, a lot of persuasion to them to come along with us on this necessity. Today we must develop federal structures on a global level. To deal with world problems, we need a system of enforceable world law, a democratic federal world government. You know, what Alexander Hamilton wrote about the need for law among the 13 states applies today to the approximately 200 sovereignties in our global village, all of which are going to have to be convinced to give up some of that sovereignty to the better, greater union. There can't be a world without some disagreement, probably occasional violence, but it will be a world where the overwhelming majority of national leaders will consistently abide by the rule of world law if we have our way and can sell our program. And those who won't obey the law, the international law with which we'll be governed, are going to be dealt with effectively and with due process of the structures of that same world law. We helped create the United Nations, of course. We helped develop the UN assessment formula by which it is financed, so many years ago now, the League of Nations after World War I. Our failure to live up to our obligations to the United Nations is led by a handful of willful senators who choose to pursue their narrow, selfish political objectives at the cost of our nation's conscience. They pander to and are supported by the Christian Coalition and the rest of the religious right wing. Their leader, Pat Robertson, has written in a book a few years ago that we should have a world government, but only when the Messiah arrives. He wrote, and literally, any attempt to achieve world order before that time must be the work of the devil. Well, join me. I'm glad to sit here at the right hand of Satan.
We would like to bring you a message from the First Lady of the United States, Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Good evening and congratulations, Walter, on receiving the World Federalist Association's Global Governance Award. For more than a generation in America, it wasn't the news until Walter Cronkite told us it was the news. Every night at 6 o'clock, we welcomed you into our living rooms and listened as you explained the complex events of the day. Whether it was the space race or the Vietnam War, presidential elections, or peace treaties, you were there, telling us in simple yet riveting prose what was happening. You became a trusted member of my family and of families across America. For decades you told us the way it is. But tonight we honor you for fighting for the way it could be. So thank you, Walter. Thank you for inspiring all of us to build a more peaceful and just world. We are still listening to your every word. And with your continuing leadership, we can sail across these unnavigated seas into the 21st century. And there's no better captain I can imagine than you. Thank you.
A truly global system of government is a system of government which has relatively little or no regard for the thoughts, standards, and traditions of the government systems of other countries.
It is a big idea, a new world order.
Many people think of the United Nations as a global government, but it is not really a global government in the truest sense. Many of the laws being passed through the UN at the international level do indeed show little regard for the global population which the UN claims to protect, but the UN still does not qualify as a global government in the truest sense, because it has not taken control of the governments of all nations to the point where everyone is at the complete mercy of the UN. One way to illustrate this is to say that if the ruling body of the UN decided one day to outlaw all religion, it would have a problem because the US Constitution guarantees freedom of religion to anyone in the US. If the UN ruling body decided to outlaw the use of firearms, they would be met with resistance in the US because, again, The Constitution and Bill of Rights of the U.S. guarantees the right of citizens to keep and bear arms. As many of us realize, these rights have been under attack to a great degree in recent years. Concerning the right of the citizen to worship God in the manner in which he or she chooses, there are those who would like to outlaw all monotheistic religions, and Christianity in particular. 60 or 70 years ago, even if someone was not a Christian, they might at the very least agree that Christians should have the right to evangelize the public if they so choose, and most people held to Christian ethics and behavior in some form, even if they were not followers of Christ. Today, that is vastly different. Today, there are a myriad of movies, books, and television series which openly work against Christianity while elevating other religions. Concerning gun ownership, this right has also come under a steadily increasing attack in recent years. Some of the ideas and opinions expressed to limit who can own a gun certainly make sense, but many don't make sense. It would seem that some people believe that the only people who should have guns are the police and military. What they do not seem to realize is that the right to keep and bear arms was intended for the average citizen to stand against and protect himself from an out-of-control military dictatorship if it ever broke out in America. The concern of the Founding Fathers was that someone may come to power in the White House or Congress or both who would potentially threaten the liberties and freedoms of the American people, which those Founding Fathers had spilled their own blood to secure for the people. The right to keep and bear arms was supposed to be a safeguard against the confiscation and restriction of arms necessary to enslave the American people and reintroduce them to a servile system of government which promoted lords and serfs once again. Your right to own an $800 .389 bolt-action rifle with a $600 scope isn't so you can impress your friends and shoot Bambi. It is so you can defend yourself against a military takeover of your country. So you should ask yourself the question, is the real reason for gun control to keep kids from getting shot up at school, or to prepare for a military dictatorship? Again, you decide. Since the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights affords the United States citizen these basic rights to protect themselves, we need to look at the subject of the USA Patriot Act and ask ourselves the question, what does the USA Patriot Act do?
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go
I'm
wild.
sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web.
Number
page.
322?
First of all, if you look at the psychological side of it, the very name of the bill implies that if you are against it, you are not a patriot. If you are not a patriot, then where does that put you? You decide. Disagreeing with the USA Patriot Act instantly puts you at odds with those who consider themselves to be patriotic, even if they have no idea what is in that bill, even if they've never read it. This is a low-level psychological technique. Most people don't enjoy the emotional pressure of being separated from the majority because of their opinion on a certain issue. It is difficult to endure the opposition from friends, family, and society in general simply because you may not see things the way that they do. And so if you disagree with a change in legislation under the proposed explanation that it will keep you safe, then you might encounter such emotional opposition from others. For some people, they will agree with the majority just to be accepted by the majority. We've all done that at some point, regardless of what the issue may have been. So we can all understand this. If a person does that for a length of time, they will actually begin to accept what they were originally in conflict with, simply because of the repetition of saying that you are for that particular thing, even though you weren't in the beginning, regardless of what the issue is. The name of the USA Patriot Act also implies that if you are for it, then you are a patriot. In this way, you become part of the group of those who agree with it, and in doing so, you are welcomed with open arms by the majority. Most people appreciate the comfort of being accepted by the majority of society, and this fact will continue to keep a person steadfast in their following of the crowd, because subconsciously they understand that if at some point they did begin to disagree with the majority, the emotional acceptance which they enjoy as a part of that majority would also cease. For some, but not all, this will prevent them from accepting any evidence which might show that they were originally deceived. So just in the name of the bill itself, it can be seen that great and varying levels of psychological tactics are being used to keep this bill in force. Oftentimes, influencing public opinion is the key to the success of any legislation which might potentially infringe upon a person's rights guaranteed to them by the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. In the interest of fairness, we should also briefly discuss the potential benefits to the American citizen contained in the USA Patriot Act. It is my belief that every American should take an interest in reading at least 1 or 2 full pages of this bill, in addition to the title pages, to get a more detailed idea of what is contained therein. The powers of the USA Patriot Act enable the government to go into the homes of suspected terrorists and conduct searches without a warrant. The government can listen to phone calls and trace internet activity. In addition, the government can now detain suspected terrorists for an indefinite amount of time with absolutely no evidence other than their suspicions against suspected terrorists. All of these powers could be seen as a great help in fighting terrorism, if used only against terrorists hiding on American soil. Section 412 of the USA Patriot Act gives the government the power to declare someone an enemy combatant and thereby imprison that person without a trial. This was the case with Jose Padilla, a United States citizen who was arrested in 2001 for being suspected of aiding terrorists. He was then declared an enemy combatant. He was imprisoned without a trial only because he was under suspicion of aiding terrorists. He was charged with conspiring to aid terrorists in the construction of a dirty bomb, but no evidence has been presented to convict him of that charge or any other. Still, he remains a prisoner in a Florida penitentiary, even though he has not been convicted of a crime. He is being held simply for being declared a suspected terrorist. Jose Padilla may very well be a terrorist, I don't know. But so far, the government has not been able to prove that he is, nor has it been able to prove that Osama bin Laden was involved in planning the attacks of 9/11. These are the powers given to the government by the USA Patriot Act, and I leave the viewer to decide if these are powers over the American people, which the government really does need to have, or if the government can operate efficiently against terrorism without such powers. Let's talk about Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was born on March 28, 1928 in Warsaw, Poland, and he is a Polish-American political scientist, a geostrategist, and statesman who served as United States National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981, known for his hawkish foreign policy at a time when the Democratic Party was increasingly dovish. He is a foreign policy realist. For those of you who have seen my documentary on 9/11, you will remember that I included video footage which features Brzezinski in a news report back in 1980 when the US entered the war in Afghanistan to neutralize the Soviet threat in that region. What most people don't know is that the CIA founded and funded Al-Qaeda in that region prior to America's entry into that war. I won't go into the particulars of that in this documentary, but even Brzezinski admitted this to a French periodical. Keeping this in mind, I would like to examine my copy of Brzezinski's book entitled The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. You too can buy a copy at Barnes & Noble for about $18. But I will briefly examine my findings of his book here in the next few minutes, and you will be able to draw a conclusion from his own words as to what is happening in the world even as you sit and watch this documentary. Bear in mind that this book was published in 1997, well before the more recent entry of US military presence into Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's look at some quotes from the introduction page. Here, you can see that Brzezinski writes about how the role of the US in hindering and even controlling the political rise of power in the Eurasian continent is critical in maintaining America's influence upon that region. He writes that American foreign policy must employ its influence in Eurasia, with the US as the political arbiter, which means that the US must be the authority in that region, which it is today. He goes on to say that Hitler and Stalin both understood that for them to control the world, they must control the Eurasian continent and its resources. He speaks further about America's role in a global community, in that America will be the nation which actually shapes a global government and brings it into being. He then states again that it is imperative that no Eurasian power be allowed to rise up and oppose the US. And with that, he tells the reader that this is the entire reason for his composition of this book, as a geostrategy for America to dominate Eurasia in order to bring about a global community. Next, we move on to pages 6 and 7, where Brzezinski writes about the political climate after World War II and sums up the Cold War as a contest between America and the Soviet Union for the prize of the Eurasian continent. With each passing page, one gets the impression that Brzezinski sees Eurasia not so much as an area of the world with the largest populations of people, but only as a prize to be had, the spoils of war and conquest. He also admits on page 7 that America's entry into Afghanistan back in 1980 had little to do with freeing the people of that region from Soviet oppression, but more to do with America's political and material interests in the region. Remember, this man was instrumental in orchestrating the military presence of the US in that region under Jimmy Carter at that time. On page 25, Brzezinski states that if it had not been for the attack on Pearl Harbor back in 1942, the American public would not have supported entry into that war, but the public outrage of that attack was enough to get the support of the general public, so that they would change their minds about the matter. As we look at Chapter 2, we see more ravings about how Eurasia is the most valuable geopolitical prize. Remember, in this man's mind, we aren't talking about the lives of almost 2/3 of the world's population. We're talking about money and power. This becomes clear as you read through the first paragraph and find the quote, "America's global primacy is directly dependent upon how long and how efficiently its preponderance on the Eurasian continent is sustained." So here, we see the desperation of this man to convince his readers that an American presence in that region hinges directly upon whether or not America will continue to be a world power. And on page 31, he flatly states that whatever political power dominates Eurasia militarily would have control over two of the world's most advanced and economically productive nations. Brzezinski rambles on about how the majority of the world's wealth is located under the soil of the Eurasian continent in the form of oil, coal, and minerals, and how it is imperative that America gain control of that region and destroy any political power in that region, which could endanger America's control of that area. If you wonder why we occupied Iraq under the premise that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and then, when it was discovered that he did not have any, we still built permanent military bases there, set up a government structured in a way which is favorable to us economically, and are still there today, all you have to do is read this man's book to understand why that may be. Don't be deceived just because you may not know who this man is. This man is very influential in Washington, D.C., and U.S. politics in general. He's like Henry Kissinger, who you may hear about from time to time, but you still aren't clear on his role in government. These men are political scientists. They come up with strategies of how America can divide and conquer and enjoy the spoils of war. On page 35, Brzezinski laments that there are too many people in the region with a history of ambitious and politically energetic states, and this forces a high cost to be paid by the U.S. to deploy its resources onto the continent. He states that the U.S. must be careful, deliberate, and clever in how it chooses to accomplish this deployment. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what he's really saying, but he's always careful not to mention that we need to create a situation which will convince the American public and the rest of the world that we need to have a military presence in that region. Since the formation of the United Nations, a country cannot just declare war on another country without due cause. So there must be a reason for a country to invade another country in order for it to have official support from the United Nations, and therefore the representatives of countries involved in the United Nations. It works in this manner. If a country is found to have just cause to invade another country, it has the full support of its allies in the war effort, as well as no liability for war crimes. So it is imperative that if a country were so inclined to illegally invade another country, they would have to convince the entire world that they have just cause to do so. Most shocking of all, on page 36 we find the incredible quote, "The pursuit of power is not a goal that commands popular passion, except in conditions of a sudden threat or challenge to the public sense of domestic well-being." You really don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to understand what he is saying there. But then he continues, the economic self-denial, that is, defense spending, and the human sacrifice, or casualties even among professional soldiers, required in the effort are uncongenial to democratic instincts. Isn't he saying that in order for America to remain a world power, we have to trick the world into thinking that there is a threat against the American public, and if a few American soldiers die along the way, it's okay, because we're talking about the geopolitical prize of the Eurasian continent, and America's continued domination of the world? That's exactly what this guy is saying. Buy the book and read it for yourself, and you will see just how maniacal this man really is. On page 53, we see a map of our current military presence abroad in the Eurasian continent, included in a book published in 1997, before any of this ever came to pass. There was no excuse to go into Afghanistan or Iraq or Iran at that time, and the American public wasn't being continually brainwashed with the continuous threat from our government and media that we need to just accept what they are doing, or Osama the boogeyman will get us while we're flying on a plane or at a football game. You may still think that Zbigniew Brzezinski is nobody special, but here's a look at the back cover of his book. As you can see, the Los Angeles Times reviewed his book, as did Helmut Schmidt, a German political scientist, and as did Newsweek and Publishers Weekly. As if that were not enough, Brzezinski is currently a top advisor to Barack Obama, who has spent more money on military efforts in Eurasia than Bush ever did. And in fact, Obama is just continuing many of the things which Bush did to facilitate Brzezinski's dream of Eurasian dominance. The problem is that most people choose to be a member of either the Republican or Democratic Party. Once you have bought into the idea that you need to root for your team, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it is very likely that you will support whatever view your party as a whole attains to on any issue. An example of this is to say that if you are a Democrat, you will talk bad about Republicans and say that they are warmongers, and that we need to bring our troops home because the war in Iraq is unjust and illegal. Now, if you're a Republican, you might say to yourself that all Democrats are immoral sissies who don't want to get their hands dirty, and they're too blind to see that Barack Obama is raping them and us. There is some truth to what both sides are saying, but the point is that no matter who is in the Oval Office, whether he is a Republican or a Democrat, he will always be protected from any evil which he does because of the support of his party. Either side wants their wonderful president to win, so the president, no matter who he is, knows that he cannot lose. Public opinion is the staying power of any president, and if you only have a 20, 30, or 40% approval rating, that's still 20, 30, or 40% of the American public who still worships the very ground that you walk on. In that situation, you cannot lose.